Hi, and welcome to week 3 of the course. We have just finished week 2, and a large number of you posted and were very engaged. In fact, I've made notes on pretty much everyone's observations, and I think for the most part that you guys are really engaging the literature and also engaging in the various areas of exploration and realism, African American literature, and you really are focusing on creating a sense of what's going on with these pieces of literature in a larger context, which is really the key guiding force behind this course. In fact, realism was something that a lot of you really focused on. What realism was in reference to what Henry James argued in his treatise, but also what you were seeing going on in the various pieces that you read. For instance, Corwin mentioned that realism is about telling a story using great details, which is something that a lot of you picked up on, this notion of realism as a strategy, which Charles Thomas mentioned, quoting Amy Kaplan, saying that realism is a strategy and manages the threats of social change. That idea of social change, slavery, even a comparison to what's going on today, which is Monday, the 21st of January, which is Inauguration Day, and Martin Luther King Jr. Day, that you were mentioning some of these contemporary parallels. April really focused on the idea that realism in writing is based on the knowledge you give. The goal is to be open enough to take in information about the world and retell it. And this is really a good commentary on realism, in that realism is about the verisimilitude of capturing what's actually happening, not filtering it, not making an impression of it, not tooling with it, but really like capturing a photograph. We also have the idea of, let's see, Carmen mentioned that reading Chestnut's work in particular made you feel as if you were in the 1850s, that the lushness of the hotels and things that were being captured were very, very rich. Lacey mentioned that the passing of Grandison really captured real-life events. The story of realism was very apparent. We also had the idea of the connection to reality and the loss, that kind of sense that an author is always trying to write it, from Princetta. And Justin mentioned both a combination of realism being to capture a mental picture, but also to reflect on the oral tradition, which Joe picked up too. And we also heard from Rachel, who said James really wanted it to make it all real. Brandy mentioned that imagination, which we sometimes don't connect with realism, is also important because it can take us into this world, which we would not otherwise consider. So that sometimes a realistic work actually requires a fair bit of imagination for us to encounter it. We also had a good, Betty pulled in the idea of Lathrop's Realism Reveals, which is a great catchphrase for you to remind yourself of what realism is, that realism reveals. And then, of course, Angela focused on the idea of the past and history. And then we also had this notion from Michelle about the importance of truth. Vera had a great overview also. Now, in relate to realism, I do want to just spend a little bit of time with realism, in the sense that realism is something we want to keep in our mind. Realism is kind of about the assumptions of what's going on in a work. It's very pragmatic, but at the same time, it does want you to focus on the connection between logic and then, of course, the connection back. Now, many of you with Henry James, in his The Art of Fiction, he wants you to keep faith with truth and represent life as we actually find it. So it's that revealing, that realism reveals. The only reason for the existence of a novel is that it does attempt to represent life. And this is something that he really does hold true to. He places greater emphasis not only on the external reality, but he really wants to focus on this inner life, the life of the mind, the life of the soul. and that there's a mediation that occurs from watching something happening to that interpolation that occurs that then pushes out that meaning. James also insists on this power to guess the unseen from the seen, to trace the implication of things, to judge the whole piece by a pattern. He also makes that argument that experience is never limited. It is never complete either. It is an immense sensibility that kind of you're feeling it, it's pulling in. It's kind of a huge spider web of the finest silken thread suspended in the chamber of consciousness and catching every airborne particle in its tissue, which is something that Reynaldo really focused on. Even though she did not enjoy reading the essay, James, but there was a good use of the spider web analogy, which was, I really do think that that's something key to understanding from Lathrop's Realism Reveals, is this notion of the spider web. There is this paradox with James. If the reader is, as you all are, if the reader is the ultimate arbiter of a fiction's realism, if you get to decide it as the reader, and as James argues, the only test of a novel's truth is in its knowledge of life, then you can maybe see why, being a reader and being a student, you might not see him as being realistic. James's focus is very clean. It's of a different class. It doesn't have the same sense of realism. His narratives, James's writings, often ignore the experiences of the everyday. It focuses on more of an exalted middle or even an upper middle class, the lower classes, balancing your checkbook, finding a train, things like that. Those don't appear in his work. There's a complexity to James and how he sees realism. Now, when we talk about that notion of realism, many of you, when we talked a little bit about the Uncle Remus stories, and you did reread them for today, you mentioned that you really didn't like the dialect. Gwendolyn said that she enjoyed reading all of these works, but that some of you, like Charles mentioned that it was difficult to read the dialect, and we had talked about this last in week 1, that there was this kind of reflection of education, which Raymond focused on, that the dialect reflects the lack of education, that there's a sense of the Jerry actually pulled in this idea of the shift in grammar with Dunbar, which did pull in a different concept. And then, of course, let's see, a little too internal. So there were a couple of you, like I said, Daniel mentioned it was a hard read, that focused on Harris's use of the dialect as kind of being distancing. And I just want to let you know that Harris was, of course, a very prolific writer. He does have this sense of looking back at the past with almost kind of it wasn't much better then kind of perspective. His work is not as popular as it once was because he does have a sense of being kind of a panderer. But he does use this dialect that's not his own to capture a population. He does really look at the idea of slave homes, of southern plantations, of children's literature, of teaching, of engaging in a very different way than, let's say, when we're reading Chestnuts, The Passing of Grandson, which is a very different text than the Uncle Remus stories. In fact, Deborah W. connected the morality of realism with Chestnut's work. Also, Deborah brought up some ideas about the luxury of reading at this time, and this does connect back to that notion of James and the classes, who was doing the reading, who had access to these resources. We also have from Hattie that the story, Harris's Chestnut's story, was very well developed. We also, from Joshua, the idea that the story made you feel which brought up another aspect of realism. And then, of course, that Jeremy connected it to this idea of giving voice to a population that's still occurring today in contemporary literature and contemporary history, in particular, a connection to today's events. Monica mentioned that in her posting, which was a little bit informal and needs to be tweaked just a little bit, Monica, that this kind of dialect, this kind of engaging, did present a point of view. Michelle had some great biographical information. I would like to see more story in there. But the idea of passing for realism, that there is as Laura mentions, a good sense from James that will allow you to understand it. And that even nowadays, slavery is still a very touchy issue, so the fact that this was treating slavery in a different way really did present, as Chastity mentioned, in conjunction with Chopin, that realism presents the real life, or to real life. Naya also pulled in that mindset of the slave to kind of really show that depth. Now, you can see in Chestnut that he's very interesting, is that he is an African American. He is working in an area that is dominated by white males. His situation is very complex, as some of you have pointed out in your biographical information. And he really does do a breadth and depth to this writing that is very different from other white voices of this time. He was a supreme paradox in many ways. He is a black writer, but he is of mixed race. He narrates black experience in a context already well supplied with narratives of black experience, but that were written by white people. So he's trying to do a more realistic telling of this experience. When he is writing, the situation for the African American population had changed much in that 30-year period. There was still, of course, a scattering and diversity of histories, identities, and perceptions, but there was this notion of where does the real lie? Is it in the rural South, in the plantation or life? How far can you get away from that past? There's also this situation of irony in that, as an artist, he works in a mode in which the flashy counterfeit often strikes the reading audience as more true than what actually is true. So there's that push and pull, that irony in his work. In his work, he speaks in this chorus of voices. He violates expectations often. He doesn't firmly hold on to one thing. He doesn't just plot, but he thinks about the terms of being a realist. He is more like Twain or James or Warton. He often throws plausibility out the window in pursuit of what he sees as real, or the realism. His goal ultimately, of course, is to use whatever representational strategies were available to him, realism, local color, the folk tale, to create depictions of African Americans that could put to rest those racist stereotypes of the earlier literature. So he's really trying to use all the tools in his trade to really silence or to really counter those stereotypes that are existing. There's a tone and viewpoint that does have some anger to it, and in fact, someone mentioned the anger. Jerry did. That this work does have this sense of anger below it. And I definitely think it's something for you to keep in mind, particularly as we kind of go forward. Now, a lot of you, when we were going through Dunbar, you focused on his idea of kind of, let's see, Deborah mentioned that Dunbar captures trials and tribulations of slavery. Jeffrey really put Dunbar as a pioneer of African American writing. Althea mentioned that Dunbar drew extensively from his experiences, and Janice really pulled in the idea that Dunbar embodies the black experience through sentiments and authentic language. We also had many of you that focused on those strange in Dunbar's writing. He, of course, was a very prolific poet. He worked in many different forms and voices. He really worked at the turn of the 20th century. His voice is one that can speak to a predominantly white reading public that understands and respects, while he still affirms a distinct contribution through his dialect and through his symbolism, this sense and sensibility that really does reflect back to that poetic tradition of Tennyson, of these other kind of more exalted transcendental or even almost Victorian writers. We do have a lot of work also in that he did do some painting, and he also really focused on some ideas of engaging, like William Blake, in that kind of conjunction between art as a visual medium and art as a linguistic medium. Overall, I do think, as I go through and I make my notes and I'm reading, that you guys are getting a good sense of how to engage the literature. Now, I'm going to recommend that I don't see really any problems with your main postings. Most of you are picking themes, developing them, using evidence to support them. Where I am seeing some tension is in the formality. Please do spell check and proofread and little things like that. You want to make it as engaged and as formal and polished as you can for the discussion postings. And two, for your, for your responses to your peers. I would say for the most part you are getting the content, but it's the structure. Make it a little more. Point 1 I like of yours, point 2 I enjoyed, and point 3 I thought needed some work. And this is why. 1 to 3 paragraph response is perfect for your peer. If you guys do have any questions as you are going through and engaging this lecture or any of the other materials, please let me know. I'm happy to, as I said, to chat with you or to give you any feedback necessary. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to reading your next week's responses. Thanks.